Well, the Penguin gets a spotlight in the wake of his very successful HBO Max series. The Last Halloween takes a disappointing turn, at least for me, and plants, I guess, have feelings. I'm Peter Franson from christiangeekcentral.com and Spirit Blade Productions. Welcome to Essential Issues Weekly, where I talk about DC Comics 1 week after their release on the Ultra tier of the DC Universe Infinite subscription service. In each installment, I pick an assortment of comics to talk about as a DC fan and also explore what, if anything, they have to say about the essential issues of real life. Now, warning, full spoilers for everything that I talk about. This is your first and only warning that many spoilers lie ahead. Right now, we're taking a look at comics originally released to the Ultra tier on November 27th, 2024, and originally published on October 30th, 2024. First of those is the Penguin special with maybe four tales of the Penguin that clearly, based on the branding on the cover in the bottom right corner, are trying to rope in viewers that might be interested in the Penguin after enjoying the Max series, which I recently finished watching and also really enjoyed and was totally in the mood for a little bit more Penguin. So the timing was great for me, but the content here wasn't super exciting. The first story, although it kind of gives a nod to the series by referring to Oswald Cobblepot as Cobb, or Mr. Cobb as he's called in the Penguin series and the Batman, it's not in that continuity and references lightly some recent events in DC Comics, and he's got longer hair and stuff, and so I wasn't quite sure what they were going for there, but it still had some nice edginess to it. After that was a reprint of a very old story of Penguin that I just skimmed through. I think it was maybe his first appearance being reprinted or something like that, but I was like, skip. Really, the Penguin became most interesting to me in a Secret Origins story that retold or recreated his origins a number of years ago. This would have been back in, like, I want to say the late 80s maybe, and it really dives into the idea of the Penguin, Oswald Cobblepot, being really bullied as a kid. And the story after that leans into that further in a way that implies that throughout his life, he has not only been bullied and made fun of, but he really has developed an intensely arguably homicidal, certainly sociopathological hatred and rage toward anyone who scoffs at him, anyone who makes fun of him. And I find that aspect of the Penguin in the stories about him in recent years to be really engaging, because we can all relate to that kind of like anger, that frustration, that desire to lash out when people think less of us, express in some way that they think less of us, especially in online culture today. There's all kinds of ways in which people can make us feel less than. And so in that way, I think even though the Penguin goes to these villainous actions and these actually horrible human actions, there's a sense in which we can relate with him, even sympathize with him, even if we, of course, can't agree with where he goes, how he reacts to those kinds of situations. So there was, I don't want to say it was all killer, no filler. There's definitely some stuff that I found to be kind of filler in this, but I think that if you like the Penguin TV series and you want to get into the Penguin, experience him in the comics a little bit, these are some nice self-contained stories that can be an introduction to his place in the comic book DC universe. So that's the Penguin special number 1. Next up is Batman, The Long Halloween, The Last Halloween, number 2 of 10. And this is written, as all the previous stories were, in this kind of like a trilogy or series of stories that have been written over the years, published over the years by DC Comics, all about The Long Halloween, written by Jeff Loeb. But Tim Sale, the original artist of those previous stories, passed away a few years back, and so their approach in this series has been to have a different artist on each book that in some way honors Tim Sale while not trying to imitate him. So these are artists that have some kind of connection to him, a deep love and respect for him, and I appreciate the heart behind that. But at the end of the day, most comic book readers are not going to be aware that there's that the artist of the original books passed away. They're not going to be aware that these artists were chosen for this series on the basis of, maybe their association with the artist or their deep love and respect for the artist. at the end of the day, I think your average fan of the Long Halloween stories is going to want more that feels like what came before. And I think that it would be wise of them to serve that before other kinds of priorities. And I thought that the approach with issue 1 worked for me because although it was not a Tim Sale art style, it had some things in common with it, and the color palette was pretty much faithful, and the costume designs, things like that, were faithful to what had come before in Tim Sale's work. And I, at this point now, wish they would have continued with that artist into issue 2 and maybe the rest of the series, because issue 2 took a turn that visually was not working for me. For those who are not watching the video version and just listening to this on the podcast, the way I would describe it is there's just more lines in general, more kind of like detail, texture type lines than the more open, vacant types of pencils, lines, inks in Tim Sale's work. And it has a little bit of a rough quality to it in issue number 2. And then on top of that, they start using, what is it called, like print matrix dots in comics of, I mean, I especially think of like the 70s and 80s, the way they were printed, the printers that they used in order to create a shading effect would put a lot of tiny dots layered over something that was maybe a solid blue to give it at a glance the illusion of being a darker or shaded color of blue. But of course that technique is not used anymore, but now and then it will be purposefully done to evoke a sense of the nostalgic, a sense of the retro or something like that. And that is being used here. And I really dislike it because that's not what the original art style was really known for, what it really used. And this feels like such a departure. There's a little kind of an interview at the end of this issue, as I assume they're going to do with each issue, interviewing the artist, talking a little bit about their style compared to Tim Sale's and what they have in common. And yeah, the thing he mentioned they have in common is like contrasting black with light, dark with light. So lots of like heavy inks in some places and contrasted with white areas or lighter areas. And I see that once it's been pointed out to me, but the rest of the art style felt so jarringly different to me that it was actually distracting me from the story. It just didn't feel like I was in the same world of The Long Halloween as it's been presented up to this point. So, and when you add to that I'm reading this not in a binged reading pattern as I've read the most of the previous ones. I think Dark Victory I did read as it was being published. But, you know, these stories are kind of like mystery stories that unfold slowly over time. And so when you have a month between reading each installment of the story, already that's going to challenge my memory in particular. But when you have an art style that is so jarringly different like this, makes it feel like a different story. It was very distracting. And so if the next issue is just as different, is just as jarringly off-putting to me as this issue was, it's not that I don't think I'll not read the rest of this story, but I do think I'll probably wait until it's all published so I can at least read it back to back, and whatever jarring art styles might be distracting to me, at least I'll have a better time following along with the story and the mystery as it unfolds. Anyway, that's Batman The Long Halloween, The Last Halloween, number 2. Finally, just a few thoughts about Poison Ivy, Swamp Thing, Feral Trees, number 1. This is the one book that I'm talking about this week that is part of the All-In initiative of DC, where they are creating stories intended to be jumping on points for new readers, or maybe to familiarize new readers with characters that they're not as familiar with. An interesting move. I can understand why they would kind of have Poison Ivy and Swamp Thing in a book together. But, you know, I typically think of Poison Ivy as a villain, although maybe more of like a questionable, like maybe she's more of a Catwoman type where she's often on the wrong side of the law, but isn't like villainous in the traditional sense. Swamp Thing, also some ambiguity in terms of what's his motive, what's his agenda is. But when it comes to it, in big crossover events, Swamp Thing has been counted on pretty reliably to side with the heroes against whatever the big cosmic bad is. Now, arguably, that's because ultimately big cosmic bads are going to do something that's going to just destroy the Earth, and Swamp Thing is ultimately about the Earth, or specifically plant life, the green as it's referred to in DC Comics. But I was really confused as to how to feel about both of these characters in this story. And the main reason is the way that the story elevates plant life. And Poison Ivy and Swamp Thing, especially through the mind of Swamp Thing as he's reflecting, but also through Poison Ivy, there's this sense in which plants, trees, they are attributed so many human qualities and elevated in the minds of these characters, especially Swamp Thing, to not only have the same value as humans, but really in the mind of Swamp Thing to seemingly have greater value than human life. And I think that understandably, in terms of my worldview and in terms of a biblical Christian worldview, that is off the rails from how God has ordered creation. That human beings are made in the image of God. We don't understand exactly what that means, but it does elevate them in their value from the rest of creation. And humans are actually meant to be caretakers, rulers in a benevolent and orderly sense of the rest of creation. And of course, we've gone way off the rails and abused creation, abused nature in ways that we shouldn't, and that we should desire to correct ourselves in and make better choices. But I mean, there's this extreme other idea out there that just elevates plant life, animal life to the same degree as human life. And, you know, you've got a character like Ra's al Ghul or Ra's al Ghul in DC Comics who is considered a villain for the degree to which he values nature over human life, and he's tried to like destroy the world and human life anyway multiple times. Poison Ivy, even in this issue, talks about how she's tried to do that herself at times. So, but there's a sympathetic angle, I think, given to that viewpoint, as in this story we are meant to accept that yes, plants do have emotions like anger, like love, that should be respected. And even though there's a human life at stake in this story, ultimately, the reason for Swamp Thing and Poison Ivy to investigate what's happening with this human life in the mix is more of a mystery. It's more of a strong curiosity imposed upon them by their connection to the green, which is indicating that there's this sobbing, this wailing going on in the forest nearby that both of them are drawn to. It's not that either of them is like, oh my gosh, a person, a human being may be in danger, we've got to go help them. That is not at all what's going on here. And by the end of the story, the human ends up dying, and the last word is kind of given to Swamp Thing, where he's reflecting on how death is not the end, that now she's going to join the green now. She's going to become a part of the green. So there's some interesting kind of pantheistic vibes here, but even more than that, there's just kind of a demoting that I think, I don't know, I feel like we're meant to, if not totally wholeheartedly be on board with, at least accept as a view worthy of consideration that plant life, trees and stuff ought to be elevated to the same value as human life. And I just can't get on board with that. And at the end of the day, I don't think even those who would hold that view would really be able to live that view consistently. I think in their heart of hearts, in almost every situation, it's going to come down to them having an inexplicable acceptance, understanding that really there is something that is more valuable about human life, and human life ought to be valued over trees, plant life, you know, at the end of the day. But so it was an interesting experience to read this from a biblical Christian perspective. I I almost feel like the story is self-contained enough that this could be a one-shot. I guess we'll find out next month if there's a number 2 of Poison Ivy, Swamp Thing, Feral Trees. But I would be content, certainly, if this was a one-shot and they gave their time and writing talents and artistic talents to a different story next month. Maybe I would peek in on an issue number 2 and just see, okay, what are they starting this issue with? What is going on here? Just out of curiosity, but I don't see myself really continuing with a series like this in the long run. Also, a little disappointing that as a book that is ostensibly supposed to introduce new readers to these characters, I didn't feel introduced to Poison Ivy and Swamp Thing. Certainly didn't feel introduced to a connection that they have to each other than this connection to the green. Poison Ivy says, briefly, like she has some knowledge of Swamp Thing or something like that, but I don't get a sense. I don't get a sense of their histories, their origins, stuff like that, which isn't necessarily what All In is supposed to be about, but I guess I would have liked a little bit more about these characters and what drives them, other than this seemingly nonsensical devotion to plant life on Swamp Thing's part. I want to say, why? Why Swamp Thing? I think the New 52 reintroduced a human component to Swamp Thing, but maybe that's been done away with again already. And I didn't feel like I knew Poison Ivy, Pamela Isley, anymore after reading this issue. So anyway, I don't know what they were going for, but it wasn't working for me. And this week I have chosen the Black Ring, as you might guess. Just kind of feeling meh, just kind of feeling like it was a dead week for comics. None of these were like irritating me, but it was a flat line. So they get the Black Ring representing death as I reflect on what I just read. All right, those are all of my thoughts on comic books for now. As always, love getting your thoughts and reactions in the comments below. I hope you also check out the Essential Issues podcast if you want to get all this in a monthly podcast and just listen to it. That's collected every month and put into podcast form, the Essential Issues podcast. You can also go to christiangeekcentral.com. There's a ton more content made for you there as we continue to geek out and seek the truth. For more chat about geek entertainment, answers to your questions, and news from the wider world of Christian geekery, get the Christian Geek Central podcast today on iTunes and other podcast services.